Back again with the Skyscraper in the Park, part 2. Take a minute and study these 3 images. What stands out? Do they look like buildings we've seen before? And if so, why and which buildings? Jot down some notes on this. All right, after you've done that, let's come back and look in some detail. One of the common features of skyscrapers is that they have an exuberant exterior architecture aimed to emphasize height. And we've seen this before, right? This was the aim of the Romanesque cathedrals. It was the aim of Gothic architecture. So here in these new cathedrals to modern capitalism, to these new cathedrals to economic globalism, to large corporations, we see again that urge to reach toward the sky, that monumentality, that carryover of understanding grand architecture as something high, something tall. What else do we see? In the Fisher Building in Detroit, for example, it takes on a Romanesque character in some way. Massive stone, punctuated by small windows. We see a column effect that looks like the buttresses, those thick, heavy buttresses that lined the Sainte Foy de Conques. Similar action is happening here in the McAllister Tower apartments in San Francisco, built in 1930. More window space is coming in. There's a balance between the buttresses and the windows. Those aren't the technical words for skyscrapers, but we're trying to think through the history of architecture and looking at these very modern buildings for their time. The American Radiator Building, built in 1924, was one of the earlier skyscrapers. And it shows features of Gothic ornamentation, Gothic embellishment in those gold-toned caps on this deep purpley red brick building. What's happening here? In a way, these modern buildings, this skyscraper, which is seen as quintessentially modern, a modern American invention, isn't exactly just modern, is it? We can see the architectural forms that it pulled from directly. Now, why is this important? As you'll see in one of the videos that I posted, modernism was the form that ideas took, the architectural and art form that ideas of modernity took on. Modernity, or the modern period, being this period in philosophical, scientific thought when humanity would wipe away the past. After the First World War and the devastations that we're seeing there, and certainly by after the Second World War, the idea that the past was something we should hold on to seemed ridiculous. It's very similar to what's happening today. We're pushing to reinvent ourselves. And that's what was happening during this time. The push to reinvent, the push to start with a clean slate, to base life on science, to base life on intellectual rigor, and forego the traditions of the past, showed up in the art and architecture of modernism. Sort of, right? Sort of. The skyscraper is a new form. The ability to reach such great heights was accomplished by the invention or the perfecting of steel beams, steel I-beams that could carry the weight of these massive buildings in a way that past buildings could not. The reliance on the buttress, the reliance on the flying buttress could only get a building up so high before its own weight would start to topple it. But through the use of steel beams, greater heights were able to be achieved. We don't see the steel. It's hidden behind these more conventional materials, behind stone, behind brick. Much like the Romans used brick to create a lovely facade over the new fangled engineering tool of concrete. Here we see traditional materials being laid over the top of these very new and modern steel frames for architecture. Let's continue down this road. Let's take a closer look at one of those ancient architectural forms. By now you're familiar with what sort of architectural drawings and diagrams we're looking at. The top left, we have this tiny section. Top right is again an axonomatic view of Chogazambil. And of course at the bottom we're looking at the structure in plan. And you can see, I use this analogy all the time, you can see this layer cake formation. This way of starting with a large, wide base so that to increase the height, you have a strong foundation on which it's built. Now let's look at these again. You can see the stair stepping now, right? You can see the way that the wide foundation is enabling a stepped or tiered architectural form to narrow and narrow as it reaches the top, sometimes with these tall radio spires. It's a way of evoking the monumentality of the past, evoking a grandeur of the past, and bringing something very modern to the public in a form that was already a little familiar and acceptable. If we look carefully at some of the earliest skyscrapers, we have on the right the Woolworth Building, built in 1912, and then center and left are details of that building. When we use the word modern today, if you're going to go buy a modern couch, or if you're looking at a modern anything really that's designed, is this the kind of ornamentation that comes to mind? Generally not. Generally we say modern to mean clean-lined, unornamented. And there's a history to why we think of it that way. But if we really dig into the architectural forms that existed in the early modern skyscrapers, we see this tracery like we saw in the Gothic cathedrals. We see color, we see embellishment, we see ornamentation. And again, it was a way of making the shockingly modern more approachable, more familiar. Now this, on the other hand, is doing none of that. This is the Seagram Building in New York, built much later in 1958. From the view on the right, can you see how this building was the evolution of not only the early skyscraper form, but prior to that, the idea of a columned and buttressed space, a columned and buttressed wall? The chief architect, the famed architect, Mies van der Rohe, here is using these steel beams, aluminum columns, really, to call on the history of columned architectural facades, a history that goes all the way back to the Greek temples that we saw. That idea of the column, it's subtly embedded here in this famed, very modern building. In this way, the Seagram Building was viewed when it was constructed as the culmination of classical architecture. The columns had been reduced to thin steel supports for the building's almost complete glazing, which is just a way of saying window wall, on the building's exterior. The massive structures of Romanesque architecture required to build higher and taller buildings, as well as the aspirations of Gothic architecture to reduce mass, to increase height, and flood a building with light, were seen to be met and superseded in this modern steel and glass skyscraper. If you walk down the street and looked at it now, it's hard to understand why this building is so famous. But if we think it through in terms of architectural history, in terms of what Mies van der Rohe's aims were, it really is a stunning modern marvel.